Hello and welcome to Spike Podcast Unlocked. This is part 2 of our look back on 2025. Before we get into the topics, Tom, do you want to remind people about this fantastic offer we have on VibeShift, Brendan O'Neill's new book?
Yes, absolutely. In the very unlikely case that you haven't seen part 1 of our discussion, I thought I'd give another plug to VibeShift, the forthcoming book by Brendan O'Neill, which will be coming out in the new year. And most importantly, if you're a Spike supporter, you can get your hands on a signed copy of this if you give a donation of £30 or more to our Christmas appeal. If you're not a supporter, you can get one with a £50 or more donation. But if you're not a Spike supporter, you shouldn't be watching this. So nevertheless, if you want to avail yourself of that offer, however you have heard about it, do go to spikes-online.com/Xmas and do give generously. It not only will, get the book out there and get it in your hands, certainly, but also help us go into 2026 with, all the more impetus to fight for free speech and democracy and all the rest of it.
So in part 2, we're going to be discussing the big issue, I think, that's hit the UK, migration. It's dominated the protest scene. It's leading to Reform, a populist party rising in the polls, leading to the woes of the Labour government. It is the number one issue that is constantly in polling. Tom, this has been the year where, I guess, the border mattered more than ever, really. It has been a looming problem in politics.
Yeah, completely. And there's all kinds of reasons why that is the case. Obviously, something like the small boats crisis in particular begins under the Tories. Obviously, it's gotten significantly worse in recent years because of the fact that you've had a Labour government that, whilst claiming it wanted to smash the gangs, has proceeded to smash all of the records for people coming through that particular illicit route. I don't think anyone is surprised that took place. Even just the kind of mood music that was set by Starmer coming in and saying he was going to get rid of the Rwanda plan, whatever criticisms or shortcomings that plan might have, it was clear there was going to be a bit of a softer touch applied, and so it has happened. I also think, in general, the dam has broken in the media or social media space about the crimes that have been committed by various illegal migrants, about the kind of staggering array of stories that you now see on a daily basis of people who frankly should never have been here to begin with, committing horrific violent offences, sexual offences, rapes, murders, you name it, sometimes within days or months of arriving. I mean, everyone remembers the Ethiopian asylum seeker who was at the centre of the Epping Hotel protest, assaulted a teenage girl and a woman in the space of having been in the country for 8 days. And of course, the horrific case in Leamington Spa that we've spoken about recently, the 2 Afghan teenagers who raped a young girl. I mean, this is impossible to ignore now. And the sort of hand waving and the deflections that might previously have attended this issue no longer work. People have clocked it. They've realised that broken borders are a problem for public safety as well as democracy and sovereignty and the ability of a government and by extension of people to decide who can join them, who can't, and on what terms. So it's the fact that it's become a really live political issue is sort of obvious from what's been happening. But I think the key difference is that through the protests outside of asylum hotels, through the kind of Raise the Colours campaign and so on, which is clearly kind of part of the same phenomenon, ordinary people have forced the issue in a way. They, having elected governments, right-of-centre governments, the Tories basically, over the course of many years now to get a control on migration, and that party basically committing a form of political fraud, saying they were going to bring numbers down and then presiding over sky-high numbers, saying they were going to get on top of legal migration and not making a particularly good fist of it. They're sort of deciding that they need to make their presence felt in other ways.
Yeah.
It seems like Reform are best placed to capitalise on this, but even the extent to which Labour has been forced to respond, albeit in a somewhat partial, half-hearted and internally within the Labour Party, quite unpopular way, that is something that would be almost impossible to imagine if before Keir Starmer got into government. The idea that they would be at least have to be compelled to pretend that they cared about this issue, given their own government and a party run by human rights lawyers. So yes, it's the year that this that things have gotten so bad that everyone has noticed, but also it's the year that ordinary people have forced it onto the agenda, I would say.
Yeah, Simon, I mean, that has been one of the striking things about this year is the nature of the protests. I mean, we're so used to protests being, just organised middle class, sort of elderly Waitrose shoppers. But these having a day out in London, central London. This is in people's communities. It's ordinary people. We had the Pink Ladies campaign of mothers and daughters in Epping and elsewhere. Seen people spontaneously or maybe it's obviously slightly coordinated, but raising the flag or raising the Union flag and the St George's Cross all over the country. I mean, what have you made of that sort of phenomenon?
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. I was talking just yesterday. I don't know if you've seen this week. There's been there was a long piece written in Compact magazine about the effect of DEI on a generation of young men who were excluded from the career they'd hoped for. And it felt like it had changed everyone had accepted that this was now something we could all talk about. And there were left-wing commentators saying, "Oh, I never liked it," and so on. And maybe earlier on in this year, maybe it was the end of last year, Max Tempers posted a tweet which detailed some of the sort of really explicit horrors of the grooming gang scandal, and that suddenly changed the extent to which everyone was talking about that. And I've been trying to think, what was the moment that caused this, that suddenly made everyone acknowledge it? And I really do think it's genuinely grassroots, as you say. It is what it reminds me more of. There was a lovely old, I go back to it very often, a little passage in a Douglas Adams book about endangered species where he talks about how we are different from rhinos. Human beings can smell burning, but it's not until they see burning that they panic. They go, "I can smell burning," and then go back to their work. And then suddenly you see the flames leaping up from behind the sofa and you go, "Oh my God, the fuse has gone." Rhinos are the other way around. They can see burning. They can see the bush coming towards them on fire, but they'll ignore it until the wind changes and they catch a bit of the smoke in their nostrils, and then suddenly they panic and run away. Everyone has like something that they need a confirmation of.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So we've all either smelt the burning but not seen the burning, or the other way round. But with the migrant hotels and the small boats crisis, you can watch them rocking up on the shores on the TV news. You can see Nigel Farage out there with his binoculars kind of pointing at a dinghy or something, and you go, and go back to you know what I mean? And then there is a local newspaper story or a word goes around that the daughter of someone you know was molested at a bus stop or whatever. And suddenly shit gets real. And that's what's happened. It has actually happened in that it has connected with one of the senses which people rely on to actually alert them to danger.
Yeah.
You know, and whether that it would have been much better if that had happened years ago, and it might even have been better, arguably, if we'd been aware of some of the implications of some of the changing relationships with Europe and so on that we were going to have. But at least now people are genuinely aware that this is not good. And funnily enough, it's happening in my mother-in-law's town of Crowborough. So there's some traction in our own household now. And I'm the one going, fascist dad was right again.
I think it does. The fact that the Home Office policy is to disperse migrants hasn't helped them.
No.
You know, the fact that this is all around the country, right into, deep England. This isn't often, stories about crime or whatever. You can say it's a London thing. It's, this is everywhere now. And it's interesting seeing even in sort of leafy, middle class, nice Lib Dem voting or Green voting areas.
Yeah.
Those councillors are also trying to have their local migrant hotel
she is
shut down.
A Green MP, isn't she, in Crowborough, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
Who was kind of suddenly...
a deputy leader of the Greens.
Total change of tone, total change of rhetoric.
Yeah.
This town just isn't built to accommodate. Oh, that's interesting.
The grooming gangs, you touched on. I mean, again, it is worth stressing that it was in January this year that Keir Starmer was referring to the outrage over that as a far-right bandwagon.
The dog whistle.
Yeah.
On Any Questions on Radio 4. I can't remember which.
That was Lucy Powell.
That's right.
Who said that.
Yeah.
Before being elected as Labour's deputy leader. So the Labour Party didn't seem too bothered about that. We should talk a bit about some of the almost counter-reaction in the form of Zach Polanski, notably. We've had the Green Party telling us, stop worrying about the boats, worry about the yachts.
Yeah.
I think it seems to be working. I mean, obviously the Green Party is very popular at the moment, but that line about it's just all vulnerable people are, fleeing war and persecution is not really working on anyone
anymore. People can
see
through it now, can't they? I mean, people know that when someone says these people are fleeing war, they know that they're most likely fleeing France, first and foremost. There's also the fact that there's enough cases now to make it at least something of a trend, even though I'm sure it's not a majority of the people who are making that illegal, and that is the key thing, illegal crossing, who are often fleeing charges in other countries. I think one of the things that really opened a lot of people's eyes was a number of cases in which people would be granted asylum having committed offences in this country, which is mind-boggling to anyone with even a shred of common sense. I mean, the Abdul Azedi, the Clapham acid attacker, was someone who I think he finally got his asylum on the third attempt following a phony conversion to Christianity and clocking up 2 sexual offences whilst he was in the country. So we're not even necessarily talking about the perennial issue of we do not know where they come from, we do not know who they are, we do not know what their rap sheet might be, even when the rap sheet is here in a British police station.
When they're in our custody.
And again, it's one of those things where, you know, people on the left will say you don't want to pit asylum seekers against ordinary people. The way in which the government handles this directly does that. I mean, insofar as it's suggesting that they almost have rights over and above what ordinary people should experience, or over and above what existing residents, I should say, should experience. And that came out in the battle, the legal battle over the Bell Hotel, when you had this absurd spectacle of the government fighting in court to keep a asylum hotel open, even though their top line policy was that they wanted all of them to close down, which didn't look very good for them. And then they also, through that case, were effectively arguing that their legal responsibilities towards illegal migrants trumped the concerns of local citizens. That is, you cannot expect anyone to put up with that as an argument. There's all sorts of nonsense which is spoken about this particular issue, but to almost say that, to dismiss the rights and concerns of existing British citizens so, you know, simply and easily, it really boggles the minds as to why they didn't think this was going to blow up in their faces eventually.
Yeah, they made it very explicit as well that was the dichotomy they were facing, wasn't it? Those were the two options.
A legal duty, I think, to prevent asylum seekers becoming destitute, which, you know, I don't want asylum seekers to become destitute or anyone to become destitute, but there's no such duty for British citizens.
And it is extraordinary. I watched a clip of Peter Oborne, who's been on quite a journey in the last few years, talking today about how disappointed he was with the Tory party, who seem to have abandoned their previous commitment to the rule of law because they want to leave the ECHR. It's like, well, it's a commitment to us creating the laws that are right for this country, isn't it? I remember when we were hosting Headliners just before it ended in the mid-year, June, July, there was a sequence of stories. Each one just seemed to be more and more straight out of Brass Eye. You know, the boy who couldn't be sent back to Albania because he didn't like the chicken nuggets there, you know, or the paedophile who couldn't be deported because it would leave his daughter without a father figure. An actual paedophile. And you felt like these headlines were being created by some sort of malignant, you know, trolling generator to see how much you could wind me up. It's quite extraordinary. And
if you don't agree with that, Simon, then you're basically a fascist.
Yeah.
You haven't learned the lessons of World War II. Churchill would be spinning in his grave.
Well, all these people say, you know, the ECHR was partly or at least largely created by you know, the British state. And I think Churchill himself was...
Churchill did play a big role in it.
Yeah, and it was
true.
absolutely addressing a set of concerns which were very much live and valid at that time, you know, and that's why we have sovereignty of Parliament, so that it can re-examine cases when laws, you know, and laws when situations change, you know.
And I do suspect the framers, who were actually mostly conservative, didn't have the you know, an Afghan flasher or something like that in mind.
Never could conceivably have occurred to them what has happened. No,
the Afghan flasher, I think, was my favourite example, because he couldn't be deported because his sexual proclivities essentially might expose him to hostility in his native Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Now, if you're saying, you know, we need to give, you know, safe harbour to the world's flashers.
We've obviously touched a bit on the rise of reform, but it is worth recapping. They had some extraordinary electoral success in this year's local elections. They've been topping just about every poll for, you know, in memory, which has completely smashed up the old two-party duopoly. Labour and the Tories, you know, struggling to get 20% each. Possibly even the Green Party beating them out. But Tom, should we talk a bit about reform first? I mean, it feels so normal to us because we just see it over the winning elections and seeing them at the top of the polls. But this is a once in a century phenomenon.
No, absolutely. If it turns into votes and constituencies at the next general election, we do live in quite volatile times. There was a kind of brief period during the Brexit interregnum in which the Brexit Party was topping a few national Westminster polls, but it wasn't as sustained as this has been, of course, and it was obvious that as soon as the Tory party got its act together, things would probably change. I don't think anyone's seeing that as a likely possibility at the moment. They have led in, you know, north of 100 consecutive polls now, last time I checked, bumping around somewhere between the high 20s and the low 30s. Their membership numbers, I think, are nothing to be sniffed at. I think they're edging up towards 270,000, which is higher than the Labour Party, which is about 250,000 at the moment. The Greens, incidentally, have beaten the Tories into third place, which is pretty significant. But this is not nothing. The 10 councils they took control of at the local elections.
The more councils they might have taken control of had the elections not been postponed.
And the mayoralties and so on. I mean, the Runcorn by-election, there's, all of the indicators are pretty positive. Of course, it's kind of conversation now about whether or not reform have peaked.
Yeah.
And if there's also a big difference between the kind of previous political areas we were in and the one that we're in now, because things are so volatile and because we do increasingly have a kind of multi-party, almost European-style politics, even under first past the post. It's not entirely clear what 31 or even 32 or 33% of the vote or a bit lower will mean in a general election. It could be a potentially quite healthy majority. It could be falling short by a pretty significant margin. So all of this will remains to be seen. And it's clear that Reform, I think, are aware of the fact that whilst people are very fed up with the party duopoly, whilst people are very keen to get a grip on the issues that Reform have put front and centre, there's also a lot of questions that people have, a lot of sense that people aren't fully convinced of the party itself, and they seem to be going out of their way to try and allay some of those concerns. So much of it, whilst will kind of hinge on whether or not they can continue that momentum into next year, but all of their issues have come around at once.
Yeah,
all of their previous competitors have collapsed in on themselves at once. So that's a hell of an opening if they can exploit it.
Yeah, Simon, we're in the sort of second year of the Labour government. I mean, of course, the collapse of the Tories is what has given the Reform the most fertile ground, but everyone is still slightly surprised at the speed of the collapse of the Labour government after its we recognised it early on as a hollow victory, but it was on paper very impressive.
It's hollow. It's like papier-mâché in that sense, isn't it? Hollow and very thin-skinned as well, and very, very vulnerable, yeah. And a piñata that will be smashed open and all sorts of little parliamentary seats will fall out. I mean, it's too long. Yes, Farage cannot, that Ming vase kind of metaphor that Starmer had to carry it across the line, just don't say anything stupid. You can't do that for 4 years. I don't think for 5 years. He is going to encounter some bumps. The attempts to delegitimize him with these stories of him being anti-Semitic at Dulwich College, I think those have expired, and if anything, probably have actually given him a little bit of a boost, because I think a lot of people who were 50-50 or supported him thought, wow, they really are like shaken. They're resorting to this kind of nonsense, to 50-year-old school gossip to try and undermine him, and he really must be onto something. I suspect there'll be a lot of tactical voting, whether there'll be an official coalition at the next election between or discussions between Reform and the Conservatives. I suspect the people will take it into their own hands in the way they already did with one of the Welsh by-elections, wasn't it, where they got in, there was strong tactical voting, and can't remember. Anyway, that is something that people are increasingly capable of organising themselves now, regardless of whether the politicians, choose to make it overt. And I suspect that Green and Labour will probably have a certain amount of that. I do think Kemi Badenoch's had a good couple of months. She was very good after the budget, and it was absolutely ridiculous and vaguely offensive that people tried to, caution her not to use such strong language as a fellow woman in politics, addressing Rachel Reeves. Absolutely extraordinary. But yeah, they both got a long way to go. But I think Badenoch will grow stronger in the next 3 years, and I think Farage will do well to keep the full extent of the lead. But I cannot see Labour getting anything other than absolute trouncing at the next election. I mean, there's fine in principle that you have a couple of bruising budgets early on in a 5-year term in order to, correct the course, right the boat, and then you're able to sort of bring taxes back down and give people a few. I just don't see any prospect of that in the next 3 years. It just gets worse and worse and worse at this point, and it's going to take a very, we are heading into strongman territory possibly. And I will just say this as well, even though Reform might alarm some people, there's obviously a bit of a demographic split, that Reform is popular among, middle-aged and older homeowners, whereas the Green Party here is popular, understandably to some extent, among young people who just think that capitalism has stopped working for them. But Reform are fairly mild by European standards. We have seen some proper hard right parties emerging in France and Germany and the Netherlands, and by those comparisons, Reform are indistinguishable from 80s conservatives, really, in most of their policies. So I think, again, be careful what you wish for if you want to see, if you want to try and bring them down at this point.
And Tom, should we talk about the sort of, the reaction to reform, the anti-populist reaction? I know Zach Polanski and the Greens pose as a form of populism, but really this is eco-populism.
It's probably a contradiction in terms, given what is usually implied by environmentalist policies. Yeah, I think that's been one of the really striking developments. It's certainly been no shortage of laughs along the way as he's come to prominence. The revelations about his hypnotism skills that people will have heard about. And also,
which we mention every week on the podcast.
No,
amazing how that maps onto Boris Johnson's joke about voting Conservative will make your wife's breasts grow larger.
Exactly. Maybe that's where he got the idea from.
Yeah,
because I'm slightly sceptical that he was actually able to perform this service. So who knows? Do write in if you've got a good review of his practice way back when. It's clearly in response to how in the same way that Reform's rise has been fueled to at least some degree by how awful Labour have been, particularly because Labour did manage to get over the line last time around because it did claw back a portion of their voters who had abandoned them over Brexit to the Conservatives. And those people in particular are furious. There's an entirely different demographic who are furious with Labour because they essentially don't think it's anti-Israel, economically illiterate, or generally deranged enough on various cultural questions. And enter Zach Polanski. In a sense, I think he's he has kind of spotted which way the wind was blowing amongst those people who want a voice that is authentically speaks to that's the kind of Corbyn revolt and what that represented amongst sort of essentially it's a group in society that have certain grievances, but are grievances that would make most people reach for their tiny violins most of the time. Kind of the sons and daughters of the middle classes. Who are having to slog it away for a few more years at their graphic design jobs before their mum and dad provide them with the deposit to buy the house. I mean, they do have some cause to be annoyed that the economy isn't working for them, and have also looked to originally Corbynism and now kind of Zach Polanski eco-populism as some kind of answer. It's clear that base was all there to be cultivated, and Polanski has done that very successfully. But it's hard not to conclude that as he's been tested more, he has been really exposed. I mean, that's really happened only in the last couple of weeks, as is ever the case when you have anyone sort of left of centre, as we currently understand it, come to prominence. There's a lot of gushing. There's a lot of excitement, that even amongst supposedly impartial broadcasters. But as he's been given more airtime, I think we've kind of realised what a slightly flimsy individual he is. The bum wiping fiasco on Question Time. If you haven't seen it already, then it might sound a bit odd, but I'm sure you know what I mean. And then also, of course, the Rest is Politics interview that he did where he really came a cropper, didn't know the difference between the debt and the deficit. And it's
pretty soft interview as well.
It was pretty cool. Well, at least you would have thought it would have been. And it's not to say that these things are necessarily, but I think it's a reminder that there's a large component certainly to his politics, which is about the performance as a former actor, about vibes, about even if you can't kind of back up your arguments about modern monetary theory or whatever, it sounds good, and therefore let's roll with it. So I think that's an argument that is often an accusation that is often laid at the more genuinely populist side, but I think it's much more true of this left populist alternative, is that it's just kind of running on basically a phony prospectus that sounds good to people.
Sounds vaguely nice. It does bring us on nicely, actually, onto the question of whether woke is dead, which has been the title of quite a lot of books. It's
very much live in the Green Party, that's true. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you have the Green Party in the UK, which full on, thinks men can become women, thinks Islamism is not a problem. In the US, you have the rise of Mamdani. But it did feel at the beginning of the year that we'd really, and partway through the year, that, things were really being pushed back. For instance, you had, of course, the election of Trump, not only the election of him, but in January, you had all these executive orders tearing up trans rights, tearing up DEI. In the UK, we had the Supreme Court decision that basically said that no, sex is biological, at least when it comes to the Equality Act, which ought to have had huge implications for how we deal with men's and women's spaces, but we can come on to whether it has. So, Tom, where do you think we are on this question? Because it does seem to be staging something of a revival in figures like Polanski and Mamdani and others.
Oh, of course. I think even those of us who welcomed the vibe shift, as it were, do go and get your copies. realised that the battle wasn't over. There was clearly a need to secure this, to cement it. And particularly in the UK, that was never going to be possible under a Labour government. You know, a lot of these things were set in train beforehand, and Labour has had to begrudgingly accept them.
Yeah.
You know, the Supreme Court ruling is a great example. This is something was working its way through court for a very long time, brought by gender critical groups for Women in Scotland and so on. This is not something that they had to, as I say, accept. Cash Review similarly, but it's not something that they're going to necessarily kind of continue the good work of making sure that all of these bogus ideologies are stamped out for good. The way in which they've had to balance that has been, frankly, quite amusing. You know, on the one hand, claiming that they take women's rights very seriously, but on the other hand, when pressed, still failing on the old definition. So I suppose it's unsurprising. It's also a kind of reminder that whilst the pretty much on all of these questions, you've got a very solid, if not vast majority of the British public who do not think that men can become women, or do not think that we are this kind of racist hellscape which requires constant censorship and vigilance and positive discrimination to right all of these issues. The public are clearly on the side of reason and common sense, but there is a very powerful, influential section of society who support these policies, and a series of institutions who are willing to stand by them.
Yeah.
And you've seen that play out in a kind of collision course between the Supreme Court ruling and the various institutions in society who we would expect to have to abide by it, digging their heels in, refusing to accept it, trying to kind of warp it to suggest that their existing policies are absolutely perfectly fine. This battle was always going to take place, but some significant victories have been notched up. These things are a live issue in a way that it weren't before. Also, I think they're getting more of a sort of mainstream hearing in a way that they weren't before. So all of that is positive. It's clear that woke's news of woke's death has been greatly exaggerated and all the rest of it. But I don't think any kind of serious observers and people who've been in this fight for a long time thought that everything was going to be fine because a few victories were clocked up. So we shouldn't be surprised that there was going to be a reaction to those positive developments.
But I think your point, Tom, about getting, the sort of our side getting a proper hearing is really important, because it was just, you were told that you were making this stuff up, or if you weren't making it up, then why can't you just be kind? Now people do have to take, whether it's the trans issue or DEI, people do have to take those criticisms at least seriously, even if, sometimes it feels like the victories are maybe Pyrrhic and short-lived. Simon, what's your...
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. My sense is that left-wing progressivism, socialist movements, whatever, I mean, woke obviously felt like a new thing and it had a new name, but it was quite similar to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which in its own turn was quite similar to the French Revolution in some ways. Some of the sort of mad ideas that come along about throwing out the old order and restoring, equity and so on. What tends to happen is that the left push and they push and they push, and eventually they push too far, and everyone goes, "No, sorry, that's crazy, enough." And they go on, and it all settles down again. But it only ever ratchets in one direction. You settle back down, maybe a couple of notches back. So 6 months ago, and maybe it goes quiet for 5, maybe 10 years, and then it comes bursting back out again. And it's always going to be an issue. There's always going to be people who struggle to accept that equality is not part of the natural order. There is no equality in nature, and men are, have biological advantages over women in most physical sports, and individuals have advantages over other individuals, and group averages and so on will always arouse indignation. And I think it will bubble up again. Whether or not there will be sort of scientific advances in the meantime, I always had this kind of suspicion that part of the urgency of woke, as it sort of sprang out of academia in particular, was to try and kind of anticipate and eliminate before it got going the extent to which it was becoming clear just how many behavioral personality traits and so on, cognitive advantages, were rooted in DNA, which has been a significant sort of development in the last 20 or 30 years, that it is increasingly understood that, which is, for better or for worse, we are, not biologically predetermined to any degree at all, but there is a movement, a greater scientific understanding of various aspects of human behavior and so on. and that people who would always argue that socioeconomic factors were behind all of that kind of stuff. If you want to eliminate criminality, you simply have to elevate everybody's living standards and they'll stop behaving like that. And that is not the case. That has not been proven to be the case, and there is no evidence. Obviously it helps a little bit, but there's a limit to how much it can do. So I think there's a kind of, frankly, a kind of anti-science element to woke, which needs to be attacked and rooted out and confronted and debunked relentlessly and forcefully, because there are still people, for instance, Chris Packham, who we know in our household as Nature Mod, the sort of BBC's Attenborough in waiting, was on Andrew Gold's Heretics podcast this week, saying that he was proud to be thought of as woke because he regarded woke as being kindness and forgiving and generous and patient and so on. And Andrew Gold quite rightfully said that is not what woke means to most people. For most people, it's authoritarian and scolding and demands, ideological obedience and so on. And he's absolutely right, but there's still plenty of people who convince themselves that woke is simply a question of, just be nice to people. It's not that. It's a cult, and it is in direct contrast, the contradiction to an ever-growing scientific body of discovery and evidence that says that no, there are always going to be differences in people,
and in contrast with things like freedom, democracy, tolerance, the things that we are battling for. Tom, your final thoughts?
Well, I suppose just two things to leave this with. One of which is that woke has certainly taken on maybe a slightly new form over the course of the past year or two, which via the Israel thing in particular, but not exclusively, it's become much more explicitly, I think, kind of barbaric, frankly. The same people who were running around a few years ago saying hands up, don't shoot, or silence is violence in relation to BLM, are now saying globalize the Intifada and making excuses for Hamas. And it's the fusion of those kinds of forms of politics, I think, is something to watch out for. And in a way, it makes a lot of sense, because if you listen to what a lot of the kind of mid-2010s kind of wokesters in America were saying, the Israel issue and this kind of third worldist politics was always very core to that. One of the BLM founders, Patrice Cullors, I believe, there's something like Israel is the whole game. If Palestine is the whole game, rather. If we lose that, then we've lost everything. So I think that's the kind of the inner essence of it is coming out even more so, but expressed in increasingly morally depraved terms. And then, of course, we've touched on it already, but the way in which the online right, the very online right, the woke right, whatever term you want to use, this pretty explicitly anti-Semitic, racist, with a big dose of nihilism and irony, but nevertheless kind of pretty sulphurous in its views and attack, is emerging as certainly not something which represents a broad swath of the population. Certainly not something that represents any large proportion of the population, I should say. But at the same time, is a factor in politics, certainly American politics, in a way that it wasn't. And it's particularly fascinating that on a lot of those key issues, this is not as a debate that we might have had a few years ago, where you've got wokesters on one side talking about group identity and so on, and then another side kind of, and censorship and whatnot, and then the other side arguing from a position of some form of liberalism and democracy and universalism. You've now essentially got the particularism of the woke set aside the particularism of the woke right, and that's going to prove to be quite explosive, say, as we kind of go forward, and how those twin threats to a lot of the things we care about are dealt with and also put in perspective, of course, in so many ways, will be something that we'll be interested to look at next year.
Definitely. Well, it's going to be a very explosive 2026, I can imagine. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Simon. Thank you to everyone who's watching Spike Podcast Unlocked. Keep supporting Spiked and have an amazing Christmas and a Happy New Year.